All right, cool. So let's talk about social reproduction theory. Um, got a little slideshow for you. Uh, Inessa Armand, a Bolshevik who established the department of the uh, who established a department of the post 1917 Communist Party devoted to women's issues, made the following observation: if women's liberation is unthinkable without communism, then communism is unthinkable without women's liberation. Neither is possible without the other. For Marxists, gender and sexual liberation has never been viewed as only the concern of women, non-binary, and LGBTQ people, but the responsibility of all revolutionaries as central to liberatory struggle. Marx and Engels provided a skeleton of theory around gender oppression and social reproduction that Marxists have and continue to add flesh to. They stood for women's liberation from the start and understood it to be the core to the fight for socialism. In the Marxist analysis, of primary importance is how humans interact with nature and each other to make the things we need and want. That's economics, how we plan, cooperate, and organize ourselves to produce stuff. We consider that most fundamental to human society, how we get by, how we make things, and the social relations involved in making things. We call those the relations of production, how humans organize to produce and reproduce their means of life. Most importantly, who controls that process and who produces a surplus. The dominant ideas and institutions of society, like government, law, religion, morality, and culture, arise from and enshrine the relations of production. The way things are becomes the way things should be, must be, and have always been. There's one fight, one struggle, one fight, because all of our social problems share a common root in the mode of production, capitalism. Under capitalism, human labor power is focused on making commodities to be sold for profit. Labor power itself is commodified in the process, and it is the only commodity that is produced outside of the circuit of commodity production. Marxist social reproduction theorist Titi Bhattacharya says, if labor power produces value, how is labor power itself produced? If labor produces all wealth, who produces the laborer? What kind of processes enable the worker to arrive at the doors of her workplace every day so that she can produce the wealth of society? Many of these processes happen inside the home: eating, sleeping, relaxing, emotional care, play, study, etc. The home is a primary location for social reproduction, but many happen outside of it: education, healthcare, transportation, recreation, shopping, etc. This is the focus of social reproduction theory: the paid and unpaid activities necessary to create, maintain, and restore the commodity of labor power. We can delineate production and reproduction in various ways, but they cannot be fully severed from each other. Capitalism relies on both the labor capitalism relies on both the labor used to produce commodities and the labor used to produce people. It integrates both profit-making and life-making into a single unitary system. Marxists locate the source of gender oppression in the role of the working class family as a reproducer of labor power for capitalism, and in women's unequal role inside it. And not just women, but gender nonconforming and LGBTQ people as well, as gender and sexual oppression affects all. Capitalism offloads social reproduction onto the working class by tasking women primarily with the reproduction, maintenance, and regeneration of the workforce, often while also performing waged labor. Unpaid, typically feminized caregiving labor is vital to the functioning of capitalism. which privatizes and atomizes the labor and the costs associated with raising, nurturing, and maintaining workers. This is why the liberation of women and gender nonconforming people is predicated upon the overthrow of capitalism and its replacement with socialism. Nancy Fraser said, a Marxist social reproduction theorist, capitalist societies have separated the work of social reproduction from that of economic production, associating the first with women and the second with men, primarily. They have remunerated reproductive activities in the coin of love and virtue, while compensating productive work in that of money. And back to Titi Bhattacharya. Because capitalism is a thing-making system, not a life-making system, these activities and these workers are severely undervalued. Social reproductive workers are the worst paid. They are the first to go. They face constant sexual harassment and often direct violence. The function of the working class family is to provide the system with workers. There's two other ways that the system gets workers, through slavery and immigration. This means not only making babies, raising and educating them to be good workers, but replenishing existing workers on a daily basis by providing them with food, clothing, shelter, recreation, sleep, etc. Rather than being collectivized, socialized, and borne by the state or the capitalist class directly, these tasks have been individualized, privatized, and dumped onto workers themselves. Gender oppression did not exist in pre-class societies and only developed as societies became divided into classes. Contemporary archaeology and anthropology have validated these key arguments made by Engels almost 140 years ago in The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. Early human societies were classless and egalitarian. Marx and Engels called these hunter-gatherer and horticultural economies primitive communism. Women were able to combine parenting and productive labor in the home, as there was no strict demarcation between productive and reproductive activities. Labor was divided by gender, but because women were central to production, systemic gender oppression was non-existent. Class society changed that. Everywhere settled agriculture emerged, so did classes and class conflict. Thousands of years ago, from the Fertile Crescent to Mesoamerica and many places in between, the plow and advances in irrigation enabled societies to grow more food than they needed, the first surpluses. Tiny idle classes came to dominate the surpluses, produced by massive laboring classes. This is also when the first cops appear, the first defenders of wealth that isn't theirs. With class society, the family as we know it began to take form. The specific form of the family has varied in accordance with the mode of production. Just as gender roles are socially and not naturally constructed, the family is a social institution, not a biological necessity or an eternal form. Settled agricultural societies agricultural societies needed women to bear more children to help out in the fields. And organizing into family groups enabled ownership and inheritance to be established. Class society also brought a shift toward patrilineage and men as heads of household, which Engels called, quote, the world historic defeat of the female sex. Marxism, unlike patriarchy theory, recognizes that class society also brought the subordination of most men to a tiny minority. As production for exchange overtook production for use, work and home became separate spaces. Women were predominantly relegated to social reproduction and left out of the, quote, productive, profit-making economy. Under these conditions, sexual division of labor eroded sexual equality. The nuclear family is the engine of social reproduction. To maintain the family's supply of cheap, readily available labor power, gender, sex, and sexuality must be policed. Misogynist, homophobic, and transphobic ideas reflect and reinforce capitalist social arrangements. As Marx wrote, it's not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. Monogamy, intended for women only, ensures that private property passes only to, quote, legitimate heirs. Subsequently, moral rules formed to preserve monogamy. What might happen to the family under communism? Engels said communist society will transform the relations between the sexes into a purely private matter which only concerns the persons involved and into which society has no occasion to intervene. It can do this since it does away with private property and educates children on a communal basis, and in this way removes the two bases of traditional marriage, the dependence rooted in private property of the woman on the man and of the children on the parents. After the 1917 revolution, the Bolsheviks enacted legislation that gave women the right to vote and to hold public office, the right to divorce on demand, free abortion on demand, and paid maternity leave for 4 months before and after childbirth. They abolished the concept of illegitimacy. They repealed all laws criminalizing homosexuality, along with other laws regulating sexuality. Most of these gains were later reversed under Stalin. But as Lenin wrote in 1919, quote, laws are not enough, and we are by no means content with mere decrees. The Bolsheviks recognized that a precondition for women's liberation was an end to their unpaid labor inside the family. So the revolutionary government launched a direct attack on the family by socializing social reproductive work. Trotsky writes, the revolution made a heroic effort to destroy the so-called family hearth, that archaic, stuffy, and stagnant institution in which the woman of the toiling classes performs galley labor from childhood to death. The place of the family as a shut-in, petty enterprise was to be occupied, according to the plans, by a finished system of social care and accommodation. Maternity houses, creches, which are nurseries, kindergartens, schools, I had to look it up, so may as well pass it on to y'all. Social dining rooms, social laundries, first aid stations, hospitals, sanatoria, athletic organizations, moving picture theaters, etc. The complete absorption of the housekeeping functions of the family by institutions of the socialist society, uniting all generations in solidarity and mutual aid, was to bring woman, and thereby to the loving couple, a real liberation from the 1,000-year-old fetters. The Bolsheviks understood that a victorious social revolution was the beginning, not the end, of the struggle to win women's liberation. Old customs and attitudes, the muck of ages, don't change overnight. New generations must grow up without the ideological baggage perpetuated by class society. But more importantly, backward ideas cannot change unless the backward social practices that produce and continuously reproduce them change. Marxism gets accused of being class reductionist, of focusing on class at the expense of race and gender, of favoring struggles against exploitation over struggles against oppression. First of all, the socialist tradition is littered with chauvinists and mechanical thinkers who underrate, oversimplify, and relegate oppression to a side issue, independent of class struggle. Some say socialists should only raise gender and race-blind, class-wide demands that appeal to the lowest common denominator. Some look to wealth redistribution as the solution. We have to fight these types at every turn. It is our responsibility as socialists to take up the demands of the oppressed and to demonstrate their oneness with the demands of the exploited. Since gender and sexual liberation has not been achieved in Stalinist and social democratic states, those who defend them as socialists have led to some to question whether socialism can actually liberate women, gender nonconforming, and LGBTQ people. Some have concluded that feminism needs to be added on to Marxism, and that there are two fundamental structures in society, capitalism and patriarchy. This has caused great confusion. Women's oppression does predate capitalism, but was handed down by previous forms of class society. An Australian Marxist from Socialist Alternatives, Sandra Bloodworth, says, if working class men are part of the patriarchy, how then can the working class unite to overthrow capitalism? This also leads to the idea that working class women must have to fight alongside the women who exploit them. By contrast, Marxism holds that women's oppression, gender oppression, sexual oppression, I've been kind of using those somewhat interchangeably. Marxism holds that gender oppression cannot be separated out from a general class analysis of society. Bolshevik Alexandra Kollontai said, the followers of historical materialism, another name for Marxism, basically, reject the existence of a special woman question separate from the general social question of our day. And Paul D'Amato wrote, Marxism seeks not to separate exploitation and oppression, but to show how they're connected and how the solution to one cannot be separated from the solution to the other. Socialism is not only a theory of the liberation of the working class, it is a theory of the liberation of the working class as the foundation for the liberation of all humanity. And not only from class exploitation, but from all forms of oppression. The class reductionist caricature of Marxism, which comes from critics and self-identified Marxists alike, is based on a misunderstanding of the primacy that Marx places on class. When Marxists say that something is a class issue, we don't mean that it's an issue of how much money a person earns or has, but that it results from social arrangements based on exploitation and class domination. This can't be resolved via more equitable distribution. It must be resolved through a struggle for power. A class analysis of oppression doesn't diminish it or dismiss it, but emphasizes its severity by revealing that it goes all the way to the root. Gregory Meyerson, another Marxist theorist, said, the primacy of class puts the fight against racism and sexism at the center. The intelligibility of this position is rooted in the explanatory primacy of class analysis for understanding the structural determinants of race, gender, and class oppression. Oppression is multiple and intersecting, but its causes are not. Marxism has historically focused more on the mode and relations of production than on the mode and relations of reproduction. Social reproduction theory aims to resolve that. Bhattacharya says, social reproduction theory represents an effort to develop Marx's labor theory of value in a specific direction. It's primarily concerned with understanding how categories of oppression, such as gender, race, and ableism, are co-produced in simultaneity with the production of surplus value. Oppression is theorized as structurally relational to and hence shaped by capitalist production, rather than on the margins of analysis or in addition to a deeper and more vital economic process. So where do we go from here? What conclusions should Marxists draw from this understanding of social reproduction theory and gender oppression? Let's look at an often cited quote from Lenin's vital 1902 pamphlet, What is to be Done? Lenin said, the socialist ideal should be the tribune of the people, who is able to react to every manifestation of tyranny and oppression, no matter where it appears, no matter what stratum or class of people it affects, who is able to generalize all these manifestations and produce a single picture of police violence and capitalist exploitation, in order to clarify for all and everyone the world historic significance of the struggle for the emancipation of the proletariat. So I want to break this down a little bit. So every manifestation of tyranny and oppression. Socialists must be the most intransigent fighters against oppression, and the first to show that the fight against oppression is integral to the fight for socialism. This puts us at odds with the economist and workerist trends that narrowly focus on economic struggles and workplace organizing. Marxists consider not only the oppressed, but all members of the working class to be revolutionary agents with a material interest in fighting oppression and exploitation, and a historic responsibility to do so. This puts us at odds with separatists and postmodernists who want each section of the class to, quote, stay in its lane and confront its oppression in isolation, no matter what stratum or class it affects. I take this to mean that we must oppose the oppression experienced by members of other classes as well. This means recognizing the progressive kernel in bourgeois feminism, for instance. To generalize to produce a single picture of capitalist exploitation. This is back to the one struggle, one fight theme. We must consider the totality of society. We must demonstrate that production and reproduction, oppression and exploitation are irretrievably intertwined. And the significance of proletarian emancipation. Nothing less will do. As Kollontai said, women can become truly free and equal only in a world organized along new social and productive lines. We need a more expansive understanding of what constitutes class struggle. As our comrade Jonathan Cunningham has provocatively asserted, Black Lives Matter is a labor movement. And back to Bhattacharya, who said, spaces of production of value at the point of production in the workplace, and spaces for reproduction of labor power in the home, and etc., may be separate in a strictly spatial sense, but they are actually united in the theoretical and operational senses. Reproduction, in short, is therefore a site of class conflict. If we take our lead from Marx himself, then it is utterly unclear why only the economic struggle for wages and benefits at the workplace must be designated as class struggle. Every social and political movement tending in the direction for gains of the working class as a whole, or challenging the power of capital as a whole, must be considered an aspect of class struggle. The working class can fight in the sphere of reproduction, but can only win in the sphere of production. The Russian Revolution, for instance, began as a bread riot led by women, but was won in the factories of Petrograd by workers' councils. Struggles outside the workplace often provide the spark, but to bring the system to its knees, workers must collectively withhold our labor. So we need to weave together political and economic struggles by raising political issues within our labor organizing and economic issues within our social movements. Most of all, we need to build combative, multi-gendered, multiracial, internationalist, working class revolutionary organization that can fight from and for a Marxist perspective and won't settle for anything less than overturning the mode of production.